The first light of July 1st, 1916, crept over the gentle fields of northern France, painting the horizon a pale gray. For 7 days, the ground had trembled under an unbroken bombardment, the thunder of more than 1,000 British guns echoing across the valley of the River Somme. Villagers miles away felt the earth shake as if a storm of stone and fire had taken possession of the land. Now, after a full week of unending cannon fire, an eerie silence hung over the trenches. It was a silence heavy with expectation, the calm before a tragedy no one had truly imagined. In the British lines, tens of thousands of soldiers waited in the cold morning air. They were miners from Yorkshire, dock workers from Liverpool, farm boys from the Scottish Highlands Ordinary, men who had answered the call to arms in the first years of the Great War. Many served in PALS battalions, groups of friends and neighbors who had enlisted together so they would never have to fight alone. They had been told that the massive artillery barrage had pulverized the German defenses. Barbed wire was supposed to be shredded, machine gun nests buried. The assault, their officers assured them, would be more of a walk than a battle. When the whistles finally blew at 7:30 a.m., the men climbed out of their trenches, rifles slung across their shoulders, and advanced in long, deliberate lines across the open strip of land known as No Man's Land. The plan depended on speed and order. They would cross the churned earth, reach the enemy trenches, and occupy them before the Germans could react. But the reality waiting beyond the morning mist was nothing like the briefings. Deep beneath their shattered surface fortifications, German soldiers had waited out the bombardment in reinforced bunkers of concrete and steel, some dug more than 30 feet underground. As the British guns fell silent, the Germans emerged, set their machine guns, and swept the battlefield with fire. The air filled with the harsh rattle of automatic weapons, a sound like tearing canvas magnified 100-fold. Men fell by the hundreds, then by the thousands. The first waves were cut down almost as soon as they set foot beyond their own PARAPETS. By nightfall, the scale of the disaster was staggering. Nearly 57,000 British soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing, including about 19,000 killed outright, the worst single day in the history of the British Army. Entire battalions were wiped out within minutes. The PALS battalions, who had trained and laughed together, were devastated together, leaving entire towns back home in grief and shock. Letters written the night before lay unopened in pockets soaked with mud and blood. Yet the offensive did not end. British commanders believed the only path was forward, that the German army could still be worn down if pressure was relentless. The first day of the Battle of the Somme became a symbol of tragic overconfidence, but it was only the beginning of a campaign that would grind on for more than 4 months. What began as a bold attempt to break the deadlock of trench warfare was turning into a slow, brutal war of attrition. Soldiers who survived the initial assault faced a landscape of shattered trees, smoking craters, and bodies that could not be retrieved under constant fire. The hope of a swift breakthrough dissolved into a daily struggle for survival, measured not in miles but in yards of muddy earth. As July wore on, the battle settled into a merciless rhythm of attack and counterattack. Each day, British and French troops launched assaults on German positions, sometimes gaining a few hundred yards, only to be driven back or forced to defend ground so torn by shellfire it scarcely seemed like earth at all. The once verdant countryside became a lunar wasteland. Craters overlapped craters, trenches collapsed under the weight of rain and constant shelling, and the stench of death became a permanent part of the air. Life in the trenches was almost beyond endurance. Rainstorms turned the narrow ditches into foul rivers of mud and stagnant water. Men stood for hours, sometimes days, with boots submerged, their feet swollen and numb. Rats feasted on unburied corpses. The ceaseless roar of artillery shattered nerves and robbed soldiers of sleep. Letters home described a world where time lost meaning, where day and night were distinguished only by the pattern of shell bursts in the sky. To live through the Somme was to exist in a haze of fear, fatigue, and the knowledge that death could come at any second. Despite the misery, both sides threw everything they had into the fight. The British Army, learning from costly failures, adjusted tactics, creeping forward behind creeping barrages of artillery meant to shield advancing infantry. The French forces, though battered by months of fighting at Verdun, continued their own assaults with grim determination. The Germans, for their part, fought from deeply prepared defenses, counterattacking whenever possible and inflicting heavy losses. In mid-September, the Allies unveiled a new weapon that seemed to promise a turning point: the tank. These ungainly armored vehicles, moving on caterpillar tracks and bristling with machine guns, rolled across no man's land with a clanking metallic growl. German troops were startled and frightened, some fleeing at the sight of the strange machines. For a brief moment, it looked as if the tanks might change everything. But the technology was still crude. Many broke down before reaching the front, and those that did often bogged down in the thick mud or fell victim to artillery fire. The tank's debut was dramatic, but it was not the miracle the Allies had hoped for. Through September and October, the battle continued to consume lives at an appalling rate. Villages such as Guillemot, Flers, and Thiepval became names synonymous with suffering. Every yard of ground was won at the cost of hundreds of lives. Soldiers wrote of carrying wounded comrades through waist-deep mud, of entire companies vanishing under sudden shell fire, of nightmares that followed them even in brief moments of restless sleep. As autumn rains intensified, the terrain turned into an almost impassable swamp, making every movement a test of endurance. By November, the men on both sides were exhausted beyond measure. Winter's approach brought freezing temperatures that turned waterlogged trenches into icy trenches of misery. Yet even as the Allies planned their final assaults, the German defenders clung stubbornly to their lines. The battle had long since ceased to be about strategic breakthroughs. It was now a test of who could endure the longest, who could bleed the other into submission. When the order finally came to halt the offensive in mid-November, the Allies had advanced only about 10 kilometers at their deepest point. The ground gained was a narrow, devastated strip of France, hardly worth the price in lives. British casualties reached roughly 420,000. The French lost about 200,000. German losses were estimated at 465,000 or more. In total, over 1 million men had been killed or wounded during the 141 days of the Battle of the Somme. Strategically, the Allies could claim some success. The offensive had forced the Germans to divert troops and resources from Verdun, easing pressure on the French defenders there. It also inflicted heavy losses on the German army, losses that could not easily be replaced and that would weaken their capacity to fight in the long term. But these gains were measured against a scale of suffering that shocked the world. For Britain, the Somme became a national wound, a symbol of both extraordinary sacrifice and the grim futility of industrialized war. The human cost extended far beyond the battlefield. Entire villages in Britain and across the empire were left bereft of young men. Streets where the PALS battalions had once marched in step now echoed with silence. Families received telegrams bearing news of sons and brothers who would never return. Survivors carried the psychological scars for the rest of their lives, haunted by memories of endless mud, unrelenting bombardment, and the faces of friends lost in the chaos. Today, the Somme is peaceful again. Rolling fields of wheat and poppies cover the ground where so many died. Yet the past is never far below the surface. Farmers still unearth rusted helmets, broken rifles, and unexploded shells when they till their fields. Cemeteries and memorials dot the landscape, rows of white headstones marking the resting places of soldiers from Britain, France, Germany, and beyond. The Great Thiepval Memorial bears the names of more than 70,000 men who have no known grave. The Battle of the Somme was intended as a bold stroke to break the stalemate of the Western Front. Instead, it became a byword for the brutal, reality of modern warfare, a conflict where courage and endurance were measured against machine, guns and heavy artillery, and where victory was counted in yards of devastated earth. More than a century later, the lessons of that summer remain painfully clear. The Somme stands as a warning of what happens when strategy underestimates the power of defensive technology, and as a somber reminder of the price paid when nations turn to total war. It is remembered not for conquest, but for sacrifice. 1 million lives lost in a struggle that yielded only a few miles of ground, and a legacy that still echoes in the quiet fields of northern France. The end of the Somme offensive in November 1916 did not bring relief to the men who had survived. Many of them carried wounds that never healed, both physical and invisible. Hospitals across Britain, France, and Germany overflowed with soldiers whose bodies were torn by shrapnel and whose minds were scarred by months of unending bombardment. Shell shock, the term of the time, described a range of trauma that today we call post-traumatic stress disorder. Men trembled uncontrollably, were haunted by nightmares, or could no longer speak. Families back home scarcely recognized the sons and husbands who returned. Commanders and politicians faced a different kind of reckoning. In Britain, questions arose in Parliament about the planning and leadership of the campaign. Many accused General Douglas Haig of wasting lives in a futile frontal assault. Haig defended his strategy, arguing that the battle had weakened Germany and given Britain's largely inexperienced army crucial lessons in modern warfare. He pointed to the strain on German resources and the fact that, despite terrible losses, the Allies now fielded an army hardened by combat and more skilled in coordination of artillery, infantry, and the new tanks. For the French, the Somme provided a brief but vital respite from the agony of Verdun, where their forces had fought since February 1916. German troops who might have reinforced the Verdun front were diverted to the Somme, helping the French hold their ground in that equally hellish struggle. In Germany, the battle forced the High Command to rethink its own tactics and to recognize that the Allies' growing industrial power could not be ignored. The Somme, though not a decisive victory, had shifted the balance of attrition in the Allies' favor. The lessons of the Somme reshaped military thinking for the rest of the First World War. The failure of prolonged bombardment to break German lines showed that artillery alone could not guarantee success. The slow introduction of the creeping barrage, where artillery fire moved forward in carefully timed stages just ahead of advancing infantry, became a model for later offensives. Coordination between infantry and artillery improved, as did the use of reconnaissance aircraft to direct fire and observe enemy movements. Perhaps most significant was the appearance of the tank. Though unreliable in 1916, the tank demonstrated that armored vehicles could cross trenches and barbed wire, providing moving protection for troops. In later battles, especially during the 1918 offensives that ended the war, tanks would play a critical role in breaking through entrenched defenses. The Somme was their proving ground, a glimpse of the mechanized warfare that would dominate the 20th century. But the greatest lesson was human rather than technological. The Somme revealed the horrific cost of modern industrial war. Machine guns and heavy artillery gave defenders a lethal advantage, making frontal assaults across open ground almost suicidal. Millions of shells and tons of explosives could churn a landscape into mud and ashes, yet fail to secure decisive victory. The battle demonstrated that courage alone could not overcome the realities of modern firepower, a realization that haunted commanders and soldiers alike. Today, the fields along the River Somme are quiet. Farmers cultivate wheat and poppies where once there were trenches and barbed wire. Yet the memory of 1916 is embedded in the soil. Every year, plows turn up rusted helmets, bent bayonets, and unexploded shells, reminders that the war is never entirely over. Visitors walk among the perfectly aligned white headstones of the Commonwealth cemeteries, where each name tells a story of a life cut short. The massive Thiepval Memorial stands as a silent witness to more than 70,000 soldiers who vanished without a trace. Their bodies never found. The Somme's legacy is both sorrowful and instructive. Strategically, it drained German strength and eased the burden on Verdun, contributing to the eventual Allied victory 2 years later. But its enduring significance lies in the scale of sacrifice. Over 1 million men were killed or wounded to gain a mere 10 kilometers of shattered ground. Towns and villages across Britain, France, and Germany lost an entire generation. In Britain, the very structure of society changed, as the deaths of so many young men left gaps in families, workplaces, and communities that would never be filled. To walk the Somme today is to feel the weight of that history. The wind whispers across open fields, carrying echoes of the thunder that once shook the sky. The battle is a stark reminder that war, once unleashed, devours lives with an appetite that strategy and patriotism can never justify. More than a century later, the Somme remains a warning to every generation that the cost of modern war is measured not in territory gained, but in the lives and futures lost. In remembering the Somme, we honor those who endured its horrors and those who never returned. Their sacrifice speaks across time, urging us to learn, to remember, and to strive for a peace that spares future generations the same fate.